Hello, everyone. It's about 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion, Telling the Truth, Constructive Ways to Teach About Racism and Our Racial History. Thanks for joining us. We're really glad you're here. This program is being co-sponsored by the Racial Justice Project and the Religious Exploration and Engagement Program at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana Champaign, and we're grateful for their leadership. I'm Priscilla Crone, your host for the evening. First, I have a few housekeeping notes to share with you. Since we are presenting this in a webinar format, our tech host, Rose St. Clair, has turned off the audio and video buttons for all audience members. They have also disabled the chat feature. There will be some time for questions and answers following the discussion, though. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature that's usually down with the menu of icons on your screen. Our moderator will ask questions that come in as time permits. Finally, this webinar is being recorded for future viewing. With that said, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's moderator, Don Owen.
Since about 1990, I've known Don as a history teacher, an educator, a facilitator, and a leadership coach. He spent 30 years teaching in and leading public schools. Currently, Don leads a team at his consulting firm, Lead for Equity and Engagement. He's facilitating workshops about racial equity and healing, conducting equity audits, serving as a leadership coach, and writing grants, and he's very busy, as I heard. Don has assembled this wonderful panel of 5 local stakeholders for tonight's discussion, and so please now join me in welcoming Don and the 5 panelists. He will introduce them. Thanks, and it's all yours, Don.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin just with a quick background, setting the context for this discussion that we're going to have tonight. And you know, it's challenging. When I was asked to moderate a panel discussion entitled "Telling the Truth: Constructive Ways to Teach About Race and Racial History," I really wanted to set out to capture the depth and breadth of this topic by assembling a group of people from across the K-12 spectrum. So the panelists, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a minute, but the panelists that you see here today represent students, scholars, educators, parents, board members, and they represent a wide range of ideas around this topic of race. On November 8th, 2021, PEN America, which is a nonpartisan coalition that fights to ensure people everywhere have freedom to create literature, to convey information and ideas, and to express their views, and to access those views, released a report entitled Educational Gag Orders, which documents the trend that we are witnessing just 1 year after the summer of racial protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd. The PEN America report starts by saying, between January and September of 2021, 24 legislatures, state legislatures across the United States, introduced 54 separate bills intended to restrict the teaching and training in K-12 schools, higher education, and state agencies and institutions. The majority of these bills target discussions of race, racism, gender, and American history, banning series of prohibitive or divisive concepts for teachers and trainers operating in K-12 schools, public universities, and workplace settings. These bills appear designed to chill academic and educational discussions and impose government dictates on teaching and learning. In short, they are educational gag orders. I will include a link for everyone to access that report, as well as the PEN website. Before we get started, and before I say anything more about our panelists, I do want to stress that the individuals on this panel are individuals. They are not representing schools, organizations, institutions, groups, or any specific community. They are experts, and in that, they all have a great deal of experience related to this topic. However, their views are their own. please do not make any assumptions or attributions about the individuals or their responses to these questions. Talking about race is not comfortable for anyone. And I am pleased to have a group of panelists who agreed to lean in to this discomfort. I'm also really pleased that we have over 40 people who've tuned in to listen. And so welcome to everyone. We're going to get started. I'm going to very quickly just introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to throw the first question out and let them talk about themselves a little bit. We have Keyarah Johnson, who's a high school student in the Champaign Urbana community. We have Nate Wahl, who's an educator in the Urbana schools and has also been in the Champaign schools. We have Brandy Smith, who works for the YWCA as a program coordinator and is a parent of 2 elementary age children. We have Elizabeth Sotiropoulos, who's also a parent of 2 elementary age children and is also a board member and an educator. And then last but not least, we have Posey, who is a scholar. She's a doctoral student in the I School at the University of Illinois. And she also has spent a great deal of her life working with youth in the Chicago area. And now we're lucky enough to have her here in Urbana-Champaign, working at the Independent Media Center while she's going to grad school. So to begin with, and I'm going to tell you where I'm starting and where I'm going. So I'm going to start with Keyarah for this first introduction question. And I will go from Keyarah kind of in the order that I just went through and introduced you. So as a way of introducing yourself, please tell us just a little bit about yourself, a few sentences that describe you. And please share your first memory of learning about race, racism, or racial history in a school setting. So Keyarah, take it away. And I'll also watch the time. And if I need to flag anyone down, I'll let you know.
Okay. Hi, I'm Keyarah Johnson. I am a junior at Urbana High School. My first encounter with learning about race was in elementary school. It was during Black History Month. It was during Black History Month. Since most of your classes are all together, they just try and find a way to put it in. So that was my first encounter. I'll pass it to the next person.
Awesome. Thank you. Nate, take it away.
I am Nate Wahl. I am a community member. I'm an educator, specifically a restorative practices facilitator here at Urbana Middle School. I've been a community member for as long as I can remember, which would be over 33 years at this point. This work is important to me as a Black man, as a father with Black children. I first learned about racism in a school setting, I would say 3rd grade at Legal Elementary, when we read Watson's Go to Birmingham by Christopher Paul Curtis, when we read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor. Now, we specifically talked a lot about racism as it relates to past racism and specifically slavery, and I would say more the Jim Crow era. However, we did not really dig deep into the racist practices that we were experiencing, as we were progressing through school in the early 90s, which I'll kind of get to later on in my talk. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nate. I think up next we have Brandy.
Hi, I'm Brandy, and I am a mom of 2. This is kind of crazy. My first experience, I went to all Black schools from Chicago, and my first experience was probably in kindergarten. And the thing that stands out to me is, though we were all Black elementary school, the furthest we got was Martin Luther King. We touched on slavery. We didn't go too deep about it, but throughout my elementary career, that was really the only Black person we were allowed to talk about rather. And I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Up next, Elizabeth.
Hey everyone, my name is Elizabeth Sotiropoulos. I am a school board member, and I also work with middle and high school students in our community in various capacities. And I've lived in Champaign practically my whole life. And my first memory learning about race and race or racism, the earliest memory I'm sure I remember was learning about Martin Luther King in second grade. But I didn't really learn about racism until I was in fourth grade. And that was the first time I knew that slavery had taken place in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, Posey.
Peace, everyone. Posey here, pronoun she, her. I am a student at the university. I'm also a youth engagement coordinator at the IMC. The first time I was introduced to racism in a form of resistance, I read Malcolm X with my grandma in second grade. And I mean, if you want to know the story, reach out to me, I'll tell you. But school-wise, it was also second grade. I had a Black elementary school teacher, Miss Porter, who really was hell-bent on us learning about our history from a space of resistance. So we learned the Black national anthem, and I went to a pretty diverse school, culturally diverse, although socioeconomically we were all poor. So, you know, it was Hindu folks saying the national anthem, Asian folks, so it was multicultural in that instance. But we didn't learn about oppression until high school.
Thank you all for sharing a little bit about, and as Nate alluded to, we're going to dig deep into some of these questions. And the first question, I'm going to start off with Keyarah again, and then not everyone's going to get a chance to answer each question, just so that our viewing audience understands that. I'm going to be kind of jumping around a little bit in terms of who I'm throwing to, but I'm also going to be opening it up sometimes and saying, does anyone want to comment about that? So the first question is, why is it important to talk about race in a school setting? And so Keyarah, I'd really love to hear your perspective as a student, as a high school student.
Okay, so my answer to that question is it's very broad. I think a lot of students that go to school, they don't really learn about race or ethnicity and like social, like racial injustices in the system, because like they're just not taught at home. So learning at school is a very important place for them to get educated about about this topic. Another reason is it allows people of other racial ethnicities to understand and come together and share their social and racial aspects of life as well. And lastly, it's important to learn about race in a school setting because I feel like you can reach more children, and it honestly might like inspire some people to like go into that kind of field and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for kicking us off, and thank you for those insightful words. I want to throw this open to anyone else. Any of the other panelists want to talk about why they think it's important to talk about race in a school setting?
I'll go. I think it's important because Black history is American history. And a lot of the history that is being taught skips over what minorities did. And I think it's very important for our children to understand this country was not only built by white people, it was built by brown people, and just a broad range of people. Though we were oppressed, we're still part of history. And it offends me personally that we have 1 month crammed in to talk about our history, and we still can only talk about one person, it seems like.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Go for it, Elizabeth.
Well, to echo what panelists have already said, I think it's important. It is important because it's truth. It's what happened. And students have the right to know when they go to a school and they're receiving an education, they have the right to learn about the truth. I think it's also important to learn about in a school setting because students can learn what is their role in perpetuating these oppressive systems. So some students are going to carry more of that responsibility than others, and they need to understand the impact that racial injustice has played in this country.
Great, and that actually leads us really well into the next question. Nate, I'm going to throw this one to you. So how and when should issues of race be taught in the school setting?
So thank you for asking me this question, because school and education is all about, well, school should be all about relationships. It should be all about connecting. It should be all about representation. If you want to be able to feel vulnerable or to experience a space in which you're heard. So first, I think that when we talk about these type of issues, it needs to be after that relationship has been made, right? After you feel comfortable with with the person who is to keep you safe, or the facilitator of learning, or the teacher, what you want to talk, whatever you'd like to call them, as the adult in the room. So first step is building that relationship and creating a space of community. And then when we're talking about the how, it needs to be real life examples from issues or instances that are happening within the community, so that it can be relatable. And then you talk about it nationwide. And if it's appropriate, and if the person teaching it is a person of color, and we're talking about a space of experience, then you can even bring in real life experiences. But that's very tricky, and definitely based on the relationship and probably the age in which you're sharing and holding space.
Thank you, Nate. I'm going to jump to Posey to kind of a follow-up question to that. And so what are some of the methods and materials that we should be using with students so that they can learn to think critically about issues of race? And how and when did you begin? I think you already kind of answered this. Second grade, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X with your grandmother. And yes, I can attest to this. It is an amazing story. So do reach out to Posey, or just make a video and throw it up here and we can all watch it. So what materials and methods do you think we should use?
It's such a good question. We have to begin to embrace decolonial and indigenous ways of understanding history, indigenous methods, and decolonial methods of sharing stories, and also not being afraid or embracing telling counter stories, right? So I think now personally, this is, I'm not anti-school, but I think we have to currently abolish how we do school. We have to really think differently and bravely and wildly about what education means. And so how do we, as adults, as an intergenerational aspect, how do we develop, cultural understanding of history together, right? Because young people experience racism coming out the womb, right? When your mother could die just because she's Black, and because of racism in the medical field, right? So from the womb till grade 22, right, or age 22, we have to develop deep methods to talk with each other. And also, I think just to add a little to that, we have to develop how to share narratives and bravely, right? So some of that happens in, I think, elementary school. I think that's when that happens.
Kind of throw it open to anyone else. Any of the other panelists want to comment on either what Nate or Posey just said? And Nate's smiling at me because he remembers my wait time. Okay, hearing none, let me move to the next question, and I'm going to throw this one to Brandy. So, thinking about your own education, how would you describe your education as it relates? How would you describe and kind of critique your education as it relates to race, racism, and racial justice?
Not trying to give away my age. When I was in elementary school, it was not taught. And this is, again, at an all-Black elementary school, because they were afraid. So as my children grow up, one is in first grade, one is in third grade. I want them to have the knowledge that I didn't have. It took me to get to honestly probably a senior in high school before we addressed racism, but it was still very light. It was, and this is again an all-Black high school. This is why it's so important to get the history of what happened and what was going on at their age, so they won't be as naive as they may be about racial history. And it's also a way for them to figure out racial justice, figure out things that we couldn't figure out because we weren't educated, we weren't taught the discrimination until college, seniors in high school. So it is so important for the kids at such a young age to get an idea of what's going on and what happened in the past, so they'll be ready for the future way better than people my age or older.
Thank you for the older comment there. I'm looking around the panel. I'm like, yep, that's the only one you're talking to. Let's talk about this a little bit. When we talk about this idea of, even in a Black school, an almost all Black school that you went to, and race and racism wasn't addressed head on. It wasn't talked about. Anyone want to take a shot at this one? Why? Why is that?
I'll reiterate for a second. And that's because the school system, Chicago public school system, was not doing it. That was a touchy situation. It was easier for them to get away with telling us about Christopher Columbus and how great he was, though he stole land, than talk about Marcus Garvey, then talk about, we talked about Harriet Tubman, but it was like she was nice to the slaves. But talk about what she did to get free. They couldn't touch that. So you got to think about, we're in a more progressive time, but it's still sad that I went to an all-Black school in an all-Black neighborhood where the teachers were so afraid to touch that subject due to the policies of the school board. And I'm done.
I
Okay.
add
Go
to
for
that.
it, Posey.
I could add to that too. We have to recognize and understand that public schools, teachers are taught in schools too. And if they are taught in white supremacist institutions, regardless if they're Black, regardless if they're people of color, that is how they're going to operate in the classroom. And so it's no surprise whatsoever that teachers who are Black teaching to Black children are operating from a white supremacist dominant narrative of understanding. That's not surprising. I think how to interrupt that, I think we have an assumption that just because a person is of color, BIPOC, Black, that they automatically have a insurgent knowledge, which isn't true, right? So we have to do some work in like making assumptions based on race about how folks are showing up in the classroom.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one more thing. Go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
So when we're talking about what's being taught in the classroom, I think it's important for us to talk about why it's being taught, where that teaching is coming from. So when we look at what's being taught, we're talking about Common Core standards. Are these created and facilitated and thought about from a lens of what Black students need? It goes as far back as to when there were one-room schoolhouses even taught by Black women or Black men, and owned by white men. And you have teachers who are teaching from a curriculum that is whitewashed. But even so, we have teachers teaching what I would call a fugitive pedagogy method, where you're still getting that Black education in, possibly at the detriment of your job back in the day, possibly at the detriment of your evaluation at the current time. So to teach about some of these Black issues or Black history, is to teach away from the curriculum, right? And unless you're willing to take risks, which might mean that you could have dire consequences as far as teaching, then you have to teach what you're supposed to, or do what some of us did and just teach what the students need at the, like I said, detriment of possibly being taking flack, right? So it's a system thing, right?
I appreciate you pointing out the systems thing. I also, as I'm listening to this discussion, I think back on my own time teaching American history, and very early in my career, there was a resource that came out, and I was supported by my principal and powers above my principal probably for getting a subscription, a classroom subscription to something called Rethinking Columbus, which has morphed over the years into Rethinking Schools, and it's an amazing resource to talk about confronting issues of white supremacy and systemic racism. And I think about that because I'm looking at the bulletin board behind you. I'm like, yeah, that looks familiar. Um, and and that was something that goes back into the early 90s. So moving on here, thank you all for that. Moving on, I'm going to throw this next question to two people. I'm going to throw it to Posey first, and then Keyarah, I'd love to get your take on this as well. So what feelings are evoked when the topic of race is brought up, and are those feelings different depending on who brings up the topic of race? So is it important to talk about those feelings when discussing race in a classroom space?
What a great question. And I could spend 3 hours talking about this one alone. The effective response that usually happens is irritation, outrage, and hopelessness a little bit. We're still talking about the superficial stuff when it comes to race. We have to begin to talk about the structural, systematic issues of race and racism. I also feel like we, in an effort to be pleasing and nice, we lose depth. We lose our ability to talk, intellectually and theoretically about what race does in the world, especially from a global understanding. And we have to develop an anti-capitalistic way of imparting knowledge and how we think about Blackness, right? Like Black capitalism is not going to save us because capitalism sucks, right? So you can put whoever, face in there in general, we're still doomed. And so how do we develop, less of affective, like I don't want you to feel my story, but I want us to move forward, in a very radical way. So I would just say irritation, sadness, a little hopelessness, but things like this give me hope. So thank you.
Cool. So Keyarah, what about you? When we talk about feelings, what's your take on that question of, should we address those feelings in that space? How do we do it?
Yeah, I definitely think the feelings should be addressed because you don't want like that lingering question of like, I should have asked this, I should have asked that. And also the space that you talk about this in, like Nate was talking about earlier, like the connection should be built. So I feel like the environment should be a comfortable place for you to talk about your feelings and your questions. Also, the topic invoked with racism, kind of adding back to the other question, we're currently talking about racism in my history class. And so I definitely think that it depends on who's bringing up this topic, like in the question. If, say for instance, if it's a Caucasian teacher who's bringing up this topic, they have to see it not as themselves, not as the like oppressor, but like as somebody who's just teaching this topic and like trying to make it relatable to other students who they're educating as well. So I definitely think the feeling that is invoked is kind of like uncomfortable about talking about this, especially if you're a Black African American student in this class, because you're kind of like, your race is kind of like put to the side of like, you guys were slaves or enslaved and all this extra stuff. But it's really important to address that so that feeling of, should I ask this question, isn't just lingering in the air as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. And I think it does echo back to what Nate was saying earlier about building relationships, creating an environment in the classroom where you can actually address these things head on. I noticed someone, I'm not going to call them out, but someone who's actually logged on, experienced me as a white male first or second year teacher, and teaching about slavery. And because of my inexperience and my new teacher awkwardness, you know, there were some problems and discussions about how I taught, and I remember having a conversation with a student that said, "Hey, you're being racist." And when we talk about feelings, it's like, yeah. The thing is I leaned into that because I'm like, wow, if that's the last thing I want to be, and I had all kinds of feelings by being called racist, but you know what? That student probably had way more feelings because I'm a teacher. I'm a white teacher. I'm in a position of power, and that's probably the only way they've ever been taught about issues of race. And so pausing to build relationships or rebuild relationships is so critical. With that, I'm going to throw this back to Nate, not to address that specifically, but to move on with our next question, and that is, critics of teaching about racism in our country and our country's racial history claim that kids that are taught about race and racism are taught to hate each other and taught to hate America, to feel shame and blame. So how do you deal with the discomfort of teaching about racism and our racial history so that learning about these topics results in constructive learning, not shame, blame, or hatred?
Right. Thank you. So I think first it's important to acknowledge that racism is a byproduct of hate, and hate is deeply rooted in fear. And inequitable practices, and teaching about racism and acknowledging racism exists is really the only way that we can move toward a space of healing from that racism, education as it relates to the racism, and then really talk about action steps that need to be taken to eradicate, or at least to work within a system that is inherently racist. Right? There is no erase racism or hope as though it'll never exist, because it's not my belief that we're talking about trying to erase it. I think that what we're talking about is trying to call it out, trying to create systems and policies that work past it, or work around it, or at least shine the light on it. There are a lot of people that believe that it will eventually go away, and that's not my personal belief. It is my personal belief that as long as I not to get too deep into it, but as long as I'm living, I have to create systems, and I have to stand up and vocalize it, and talk about it, and stand up for the students who are oppressed by it. So to really buy into a narrative of the only way to exist in it is to not talk about it, or is to hold a space where you don't want people to feel bad about it. I'm sorry, but as someone who experiences it, I don't think that what's best is to just pretend that it doesn't exist, because that is only something for those who are privileged, right? I don't get to pretend that it doesn't exist. My kids don't get that. The students who I support don't get that. So I think that we're really doing a disservice to myself, to the kids, and to the kids who are privileged by not talking about it. And back to what I was saying, the only way to go through it is really, and to get to it, is to shine a light on it and talk about how we can work around it.
Yeah, thank you. Any of the other panelists want to add anything to those comments? Okay, I'm going to jump then to another question that is very closely related. How do we talk about race in a classroom environment without being political, right? Or is it even possible to leave politics out of discussions? And Posey, I see your unmute button is bouncing on
I'm
you.
gonna let Brandy go because I think we have very similar understandings right now. So
if you're gonna talk about racial history in a classroom, take the political out. We didn't have politics when this slave came over. We didn't have politics when we were being discriminated. It just happened. So why do we have to address Republican or Democrat? Address the history, the true, honest history of what happened, and you'll realize it's not political. It's just what happened to us. It's social. I'm done.
Okay. Posey.
I'm gonna say the personal for me is political, one, and the moment, the millisecond you talk about literacy, you talk about reading, you are talking about politics, and you cannot absolve yourself from talking about politics. Education is a political act. You know, now if you're gonna actively participate in that, that's your business. But you know, teachers are inherently political, and so now there's also another thing of if we're talking about educational injustice, you've also absolved yourself from apoliticality. I don't know. It's not apolitical, right? Because you're talking about an injustice that has happened educationally and intellectually. And so also I want to question what is the fear about being political? And if we reduce politics to like, you know, government, sure. I think there is some ways around that, but literacy, intellect, and it is a political act. Reading is a political act, right? Especially if we talk about history of literacy in this country and in the Americas in general. When certain groups of people, it was illegal to teach reading. You can be killed for that. That's political. And that's our legacy.
Because we're talking about politics, I'm going to throw it to our elected politician on the panel here. And I know that school boards are supposed to be nonpartisan or apartisan in that you don't run as a Democrat or Republican. But Elizabeth, how would you respond to this discussion about politics around issues of teaching?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts. Some of them were already shared. I think it's impossible to talk about racism without it being political, because the whole point of politics is to change policy. And racism would still exist, I think, even if it weren't written into policy, but it is written into policy. And if that's what we want to change, if we want to right the injustices that exist, we have to change the policy. We have to change laws. So I think it's impossible to get political. And I also think that when certain people say, oh, well, talking about racism, that's political, and we don't want to get political, it usually doesn't have anything to do with politics. It has to do with challenging a system, challenging something that is accepted to be normal and good. And oftentimes when people are challenged in that way, when they have to defend why something is the way it is, why they support it, they can deflect responsibility by saying, oh, it's political and I don't want to talk about it. We shouldn't have our kids exposed to that. I think that's usually exactly the thing that we need to be teaching our kids about.
Yeah. Oh, Don, you're mute.
Go ahead, Nate.
So when we talk about teaching Black and brown students, especially when we're talking about literacy, and when we're talking about teaching them well, we are talking about a revolutionary act. From the onset of teaching Black people, period, from its onset in the United States, has been an act of revolution. So if you're doing it well, you are being political in what you're doing, right? You are making politics is simply the process of groups making decisions with an intention. So if that's what you're doing, if you are teaching these students to read well, to write well, to understand how to critically think well, that's politics. That is a revolutionary act. And that is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about, liberating students, right? We're talking about freedom in the form of education, providing choices, liberating students through agency, right? Here are the choices that you have And you understand that because I'm being intentional in the way that I'm showing you. I'm being intentional in the way that I'm telling you how that was limited for you and how it will continue to be limited for you, what that limitation looks like. You know, I'm pulling in individuals who have privilege to share their knowledge and to share their positionality in a way that then provides, you know, this freedom for you. So I think that it needs to be political. I think that it continues to be political. And I think that, as Posey said, you know, there's no way to get around that. And I think that there's no need to shy away from it. It's not, politics doesn't have to be scary if you look at it in a way that is effective and helpful, right? And, you know, meaningful. We're not talking about Republican, Democrat. We're talking about liberation, okay? We're talking about freedom.
Thank you. This is an amazingly powerful conversation. Brandy, did you want to say something? I see you unmuted.
I guess I just want to make a point where I agree that it's political, but it's certain things that happened in our history was not done because of politics. It was done because of ignorance. I'm thinking of Emmett Till. It wasn't the fact that they were Black Republicans or Democrats. They were just racist. They had nothing to do with politics. And yeah, the politics probably dictate the way they were thinking, but there are so many things that happen in Black history, Hispanic history, Asian history in this country that had nothing to do with politics. Let's talk about that. That way our kids will know how to govern their future, because if they don't know what happened in the past, they're going to know what's going in the future. So we don't have to make it political. Let's just make it factual. Black folks weren't allowed to get married. That wasn't a race, a social issue or political issue. That was just the ignorance of that time. So I think I wanted to get across when I said it's not political. Though I agree with what the other two panelists were saying, I just want to go a little deeper and talk about the social part, what we had to deal with. And again, not just Black people, minorities had to deal with back in the day.
Yeah, thank you. Before we move on, I just want to relate one quick thing, and that is when I graduated from college and headed off for my first, for my student teaching, Minneapolis South High School, Go Tigers. I was given a book by one of my closest friends, and I'll call him Steve. And Steve gave me a book called Teaching is a Subversive Activity by Neil Postman. And I believe that it was written in 1969. And I've read that book 4 times since Steve gave it to me. And it is one of the most powerful testaments to this conversation about politics, power, and the fact that every decision that we make in the classroom is, in some sense, a political decision. Not like Democrat or Republican, but like it's influenced by the society we grew up in, by our own understandings of socialization. And we have to be very, as educators and as parents and as people walking through this planet, we have to be very intentional about changing those cycles of socialization so that we can see through, get rid of the fog in front of us and keep moving. Speaking of the fog and speaking of systemic racism, this next question I'm throwing first to our board member, Elizabeth. And then I'm actually going to ask several of you this, so be prepared. What do you see as your role in dismantling systemic racism in our schools?
Well, since I occupy multiple seats in life, I have multiple roles, but specific to being a board member, my responsibility, the way I see it as a board member in dismantling systemic racism in schools, is to use every opportunity I have to ensure that if I can ask a question about our budget, how are we spending our money? How are our dollars going to right these injustices, to ensure that we are serving students who have been historically excluded from an equitable education? Can I ask those questions? Can I push the issue until it's heard? Can I co-author an anti-racism resolution when I don't see any kind of meaningful change happening in a school district? If I don't know how to do that, can I learn? Can I talk to as many people within the community who are impacted by racism, who experience it themselves, to ask, what do you experience in school? What do you experience when your kids go to school, when you're talking with their teachers, and ensuring that I'm not really focusing on what maybe I think is right or what I'm experiencing when my kids go to school, but rather what are people experiencing racism experiencing, and how can we make schools serve them? Because without that, I mean, if we don't, we are perpetuating these injustices.
Okay, thank you. I'll throw it open, but like I said, I'm going to call on a couple of you specifically, looking at Nate and Keyarah specifically. What's your role in the role that you currently play? And Brandy, I see you just unmuted. What's your role in terms of dismantling systemic racism? So Nate, you want to take a shot at it?
So my role in dismantling also involves being negatively affected by it, right? So I have to dismantle it and experience it, right? I have to call it out and I have to take it in. I have to continue to uplift the students in this community through, intentional just being in the schools. I have to continue to, like what was said, I don't just know all the Black stuff just by being Black. So that means I need to continue to educate myself on current issues and on past issues from those who are experts in the field. I need to listen. I need to help put myself in spaces where policy is crafted and constructed. I think specifically, a personal goal is to ensure that there's more equitable teaching for our pre-service teachers, for our administrators, right? Not just you watch a video and you move on. There was some good work done in specific spaces that I think has resulted in some good things here in Urbana. And continuing, even in those little conversations where I call it out and say, okay, well that's not okay to say, right? And in a way that isn't hurtful. So you have to be like, you have to worry about white fragility, right? You don't want to shut them off entirely so that they won't ever talk again. But at the same time, you do call that out because so you call it out in a way that's helpful, in a way that's intentional, and a way that's effective. So I'm in it presently, and then continuing to move through it and support it on the back end.
Great, thank you. Keyarah, what about you? How do you see your role as, right now, a high school student in dismantling systemic racism?
Definitely being more proactive, getting involved in meetings like board meetings, writing letters to board members, and just trying to and asking the challenging questions to your educator or the person in charge. That can really help dismantle the system, because if you're just silent, like some people say, a closed mouth never gets fed. So if you don't say anything about it, it will still continue to be how it is.
Wow, thank you. Anyone else want to follow that?
I don't. So I'll say this. I don't know if my role is to dismantle systemic racism as a Black queer woman. I don't know. But I'm committed to building thick solidarity that makes racism and systemic racism obsolete in my world, right? So how do I build relationships that are strong enough to, when it falls, when it crumbles, when the radical folks are actually doing that we have a space to call our own, that we're building outside of the logics of white supremacy. And so I view my role as building thick solidarity and deep relationships with people who I actually care about. My mom, not actually care about, I'm saying everyone, but I'm thinking about my mom too, and our relationship and how much work that takes to build relationships that are strong and solid and anti-oppressive and anti-white supremacist based, as two Black women. So that's my role.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Elizabeth, you have something to add. Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to be clear. I don't want to follow anything that anyone just said because everything was perfect. I want to go back to what I said because I realized I didn't say something that is really important to me to say. And that is the fact that I'm a white woman. And so white people who are in positions of power, who care about dismantling systemic racism, we unfortunately, we have privileges. Like when we walk into a school building, nobody ever questions why we're there. When we ask a question, we are not pushed back against, like, well, why are you always talking about that? Why are you complaining? Like things that I have seen with my own eyes don't happen to me. And the only reason I can see is because I'm white. So I also think that is my role, that I don't get, yeah, sometimes my feelings do get hurt. Yeah, conversations about race and racism are really, really hard and painful. And sometimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I need to keep going and I need to keep learning and I need to keep fighting because this is something I've committed to and I believe in it very much. So I think it's really important that any school board member, anybody who is in a position of power can make decisions who is white. They need to use their privileges to, how do I want to say, cancel privileges so that white people don't have them anymore and everybody is actually brought eventually to a more equal place.
Thank you. And Brandy, do you want to, yeah.
Real quick, I'm gonna
Yeah.
make this so quick. As a parent, parents need to step up. We need to ask and demand that our kids are taught the true history of America. Will it stop systemic racism? I don't know, but if we don't demand the way our kids are being educated, we're just teaching them the same foolishness that was from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So I think that the parents need to step up and ask or demand that the curriculum is changed.
Participants since we started. I'm so happy about that. If you have a question for the panelists, now's your chance. You can go down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a little thing that says Q&A, and me saying that, we got 4 more questions pop up right away. So we'll get to those in just a few minutes. I do want to come back to a couple of questions that we have left here. And Keyarah, you get to start with this one. And that is, what do students, teachers, and families need to create an environment where race and racism can be discussed in schools without fear, confusion, or ignorance?
Okay, so I want to start with the basics. So students to families, I'm definitely think having an open relationship with your guardian or your parent and having a free space to talk without being judged as well. I think that goes into, like, so I know some parents are not as well educated on some topics. So I think if you have a parent that is openly to listen to what you have to say and give some constructive criticism or like feedback on what you're saying, that'll definitely help you get an understanding of what points you're trying to make and what you're trying to get at. With student to teachers, I definitely think like earlier topics, creating that safe space for a student to talk without fear. Definitely when you have, maybe it might not even be your history teacher or somebody that you're learning from, maybe just a teacher in general who is educated on that topic or know like something about that topic that you can talk to, and that will eliminate the fear aspect of when you're talking about this topic. And just like having that environment and people to talk to definitely helps create that safe space in school and at home.
Excellent. Thank you for kicking us off with that question. Nate, I know that this kind of goes back, this question actually kind of echoes back to your very first answer. So do you want to add anything to what Keyarah said?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is relationships, right? And are we being intentional as educators about building a relationship with families prior to calling them when their child has done something that you didn't like, right? So if you're not being intentional on the front end by creating spaces where families can be represented in the classroom, then it's my belief that you will get pushed, and not so much my experience, but it's my belief that you will get more pushback when you have harder conversations, right? So are you asking parents to come in and share a part of them with the class? Are you asking families to bring in pictures? Are you, so that they're posted on the wall, so that when a student is feeling whatever they're feeling, they're able to look and see, okay, well, you know, my aunt's with me right there, I have a picture. You know what I'm saying? Are you going into the community as a person who's not of the community, so that when that child you don't feel like you can connect with says, oh yeah, I remember you were at Juneteenth. You know, I remember you were at Champaign Urbana Day. You were at, you know, Douglas Park hooping with my uncle. You know what I mean? So like, if you want to be able to reach Black families and you're not Black, you have to put yourself into the family. You have to put yourself into the spaces where they might be. Maybe go to Black church. I don't know. Maybe go to a place where you don't feel comfortable, because I guarantee they don't feel comfortable in your classroom if they don't know you yet, right? So if you haven't put yourself in a space where you feel discomfort, then you're doing them a disservice, right? Because there's power when you have shared experiences. So I think that when you put yourself in experiences where you can have shared feelings, then families will be more likely to open up to you and will feel brave enough to do so. So that's what I have to say on the issue.
Powerful. Thank you. Brandy, I'm gonna throw it to you for the last comment on this question. Then we have one more, and then I do definitely want to dive into some of these things in the question and answer section. So Brandy, how do we create an environment? Specifically, your role as family, parent, that side of our K-12 partnership.
Discussion, openness, being inquisitive, getting my kids involved with the village that's multicultural, and just being honest as I can. I think that's what will set the pace for my kids' future and for the future of any kid that in that age range. I think that's what we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can I just add a little?
Yeah, please do.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we need to develop a collective radical imagination. We must begin to think differently about every single thing that we've been taught, right? We have to begin to think, even when we talk about white privilege, right? Is it a privilege to dominate? I don't know. I don't want that, because for me, privilege is something that you desire. I have no desire to dominate over other people, colonize other people's land. I don't know. Right? To go into a crowd and shoot people with no cost. It doesn't seem like a privilege to me, right? So how do we develop a collective radical imagination that sets our eyes on the future of how we want to be together on this land and honor the ancestors, the people who died, who were murdered, who were kicked off violently, right? How do we honor that by, like everyone else said, being in right relationship, right-ish relationship with each other and with the space? How do we create sustainability? Mother Earth is getting sick of us, right? She about to projectile vomit all of us off of this planet, right? So how do we do better by Earth, right? So this is what we have to begin to develop in the classroom and also outside. Because if we're only talking about this stuff in the classroom and then they come out and waiting for the bus and it's a completely different world, then it doesn't do too much. So I think building a collective radical imagination.
I just want to touch on one part that you said, Posey. You know how what bothers me about being a Black mother is that I have to teach my kids how to act in public, not to fear white people or think about white supremacy, because I want them to come home. I have to teach my kids, if a police officer stopped them, instantly raise their hands. Now, how am I supposed to tell them that the police are there for them, but I'm putting these instructions in their head on how to react to people, white people, when they come in contact with it? And oddly enough, my son was a part of an Urbana police event. So it was great. But at the same time, I got to tell them when they come home, look, if they stop you, you got to act a certain way. And that's the problem that we need to work on as a society, is to make sure that our kids come home regardless. I just had to get that out.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all. I want to jump into some of these questions here. And I'm just gonna start at the top and work our way down. This first question, and so I'm gonna throw this one out to anybody, and maybe we'll just take one or two answers per question because of the time. We're just past 8:05, not quite, and we're gonna be wrapping this up here. So this question is from Tania. She says, do you have suggestions for teaching or talking about racism with our youngest learners, such as pre-K and kindergarten age? So somebody unmute and jump onto that one.
I would suggest,
Oh, go ahead, sweetie. I'm sorry.
I would suggest using pictures. Me being in high school, we also do that. So we look at the picture, we be like, what do you think? Even if they don't know like the topic, but you just ask them, what do you think the picture is, and how did they portray the picture, and you see the view from their perspective.
Okay. One other person want to tackle that one. Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's going to be a story, right? So a friend of mine I was talking to, who is an educator, was talking about how they were talking about colors and rainbow, and they were talking about crayons or something like that. And an African student said, "Well, that's the bad color," referring to a brown crayon. And you hear about this stuff happening, right? Like, but would that really happen? So then the educator quickly said, well, let's talk about things that are brown that we love. We're talking about trees, we're talking about and then a friend of that student actually pointed to their self and their skin, and then and then the teacher then pointed to the skin of the child and said, well, we love you, you're a friend of ours. So you have to be intentional, right? And appropriate for kids. You can't go on these long tangents. You have to relatability, things that make sense, things that they can touch, things they can taste, and then calling it out, right? So I think that it's more just about the understanding of it and the experience of it than it is about like the deep-seated hate and violence that come from it. And that's not appropriate, right, for the younger generation.
Thank you. Moving on to another question from the audience here. And this one's from Benjamin. He's a local historian and activist in the community. If you happen to follow him on Facebook, it's fascinating what he's digging up in the archives. He said, do you think it would be possible or helpful in a K-12 setting to teach local history of the Klan, the judges and police chiefs who were here in Champaign County, in Urbana, in our county seat, and eugenics and white nationalists at the University of Illinois, the local resistance movements here against those individuals. So Posey, take it away. You jumped on that one quickly.
I actually unmuted by accident. Sorry, y'all. But yes, absolutely. And it's in an effort to demysticize. Is that the word? Because we like to think of white supremacy as like people coming together and gathering and, in a dark room with a little candle, drinking whiskey. No, these were people in relationships that made choices, right? So judges made a choice emotionally, socially. They made a choice that centered whiteness. And that in and of itself is dangerous, right? So we have to begin to talk about the choices that judges make. And we have a really great example in the news right now about how these are human beings making choices that are anti-Black. And how do we begin to make different choices is the question. So
yeah, I know an educator, in a local school in our dish, right? Well, who uses newspaper articles from the U of I that talk about, well, you can't, they weren't that long ago, right? Where it's like, you can't go to this bar, you can't go to this bar, we're killing, we're not letting the Black people go to the, and they'll say, I bet you don't know where this is, the teacher will say to the student, middle school, I bet you don't know where this is from. Oh, this is from Alabama. Oh, I bet this is from Mississippi. I bet this is from Georgia. No, this is from this is from Urbana. This is from the University of Illinois. And that is where the liberation happens, where it's like, no, it's not just in the South. It's not just in the 1950s. They think that was a million years ago. No, this is on our soil and not too long ago. So you have to make it relevant to them. You can't make it about slavery in Africa, or slavery from Africa. You can't make it about, the civil rights movement. You got to make it about, this is what happened right here, because that's what kids need. They need it right now, right here, how it affected people who could have been them.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm looking across the panel here. One thing I'm just going to add to that, because you talked about like right here, I had the amazing experience a number of years ago in Urbana schools to head up the American History Teachers Collaborative, which was a federally grant-funded program to teach about history in a more authentic way. That's the way we looked at it, to educators. And so it was a professional development program. And one of the first speakers we brought in, and we brought him back several times, was a man named James Lowen, who's actually a sociologist. And he wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. But when we brought him back to Urbana, he actually came back on grant money that he had written to write his next book, which was called Sundown Towns. And Sundown Towns was based on the research that he did coming to visit us as teachers in Urbana. And where was he going? He was going to Muhammad. He was going to Philo. He was going to Tuscola. And he was doing his research about sundown towns. And if you need to read the book, buy the book. I will be actually, I don't remember if I said this at the beginning, but I'll be posting a link to a list of resources that that the UU Church asked me to pull together for this night. And it's a short list of resources. Let me say that. I want to jump back into a couple questions here, because there are several. And I will say, we're not going to have time to answer them all, but I do want to hit a couple more and then turn it back over to Priscilla to close us out. This one is a great deep level question when we're talking about systemic racism and when we're talking about this, radical imagination. Joe, a good friend of mine, Joe Omosagi from Parkland College, says, how do we get away from the zero-sum game mentality of our larger systems? So, if we're talking about equity, equity is often mistakenly talked about in terms of redistribution, right? That's what Joe's asking here. How do we not make it a redistribution? How do we make it authentic? Anyone want to take that one? Joe, this is the most amazing panel I've ever seen on this topic. And I don't want to say you stumped us, but man, that's a hard question, because that's what we're seeing right now in society, right? Is why do we have pushback? Why do we have these 24 states that have put up their state legislators, that are gagging educators so that they can't talk about race? Nate, go ahead.
So when we're talking about this, we're talking about people not even understanding why we're doing the work in the first place. We're not doing it to make everybody equal because we want to. We're doing it because people are not equitably supported. So yes, you might see people getting on the face getting more or something like that, but that's because we never had it to begin with, right? When you see the pictures where like all of these things are holding you back, and then the other side is just shooting across the finish line. So what might look like unequal or not fair, well, really it's because of all these hurdles that we have to go through to get almost to where we might need to be. So it's not about if I get more then you get less, and that's what, you know, the zero sum, what is it called, the zero sum philosophy. It's not about if I get more than you less, it's about I need more, or I need different, rather, not I need more, but I need something that's different because I don't have something to begin with. You know, I might need it's just like student support. You're not going to help a student who's an avid reader with reading support. You know, you're going to help them with what they need. So it's about equitability. It's about giving people what they need to get to where they need to be. And, you know, if that hurts people's feelings, then they're part of the issue, right? So if you're not pro people getting what they need, then I'm not sure why you're in schools or supporting or, you know, being with students in the first place. Not a space for you.
Thank you. So I have two questions that I'm going to combine here a little bit. And one of them is specifically aimed at Nate and Keyarah, who are in our schools on a daily basis, right? And so it's a two-part question. So this one, Peggy asks, this is directed at panelists who are currently work and learn in our schools, Keyarah and Nate. What is going on in our schools today related to addressing systemic racism that gives you hope and or causes you concern? So that's the first question, and then so I'll let you guys take that one, and then I have a follow-up that's someone else. Go ahead. Or Keyarah.
Yeah, I want to hear you first as the student, right? I want to hear you if you're willing to go first.
Okay, I think one thing that's concerning is like some teachers it's just not addressed. I think that's like the really concerning part, which I think is the big issue. I think the way it is like addressed is you have students, you do clubs, you have like, for instance, we have like an African American club and stuff and things like that. Like you bring people together to make like a better space. So I think that's a good way. So.
Thank you, Keyarah. Nate, go ahead.
I think what the concern for me is rooted in and relates deeply to what's going well. What's concerning to me is that the media continues to focus on the minute things that aren't going well, right? Instead of talking about the restorative practices that are going on in these schools, the influx of Black and Brown and multilingual educators that are flooding our schools, the families that I see in here every day walking with kids and walking them to school and sitting in spaces where, you know, you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing. So instead of just another SRS member sitting with you, it's a mother who is taking time out of her day to sit with other students. You know, that's what's happening, but that's not what we're hearing. We're hearing about, you know, the student who's bringing fireworks to school because they want to get a rise out of whatever. You know what I mean? Okay, but are you talking about the teachers that are staying after school to meet with the multitude of students who need to be given equitable support? Are you talking about the after school programs that are happening where we have stomp teams, where we have spoken word spaces, you know, where we have, you know, circles happening in classrooms where students are really being vulnerable because that classroom teacher has created a community where you can be vulnerable and know that you won't be judged, because that's what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is students going through, once again, the hardest part of that education and teachers have seen. And you know, you have teachers showing up in spaces and in ways that are phenomenal and that are really doing these children a great service, you know, but that's not what we're hearing. great thing. I don't know what's going on in every school, but I'm at Urbana Middle School, and great things are happening for these students at Urbana Middle School, and you can tell anybody who's willing to listen. Okay? That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Nate. And you know what? I'm gonna so here's what I'm gonna suggest because of our time right now. I'm gonna ask one final question of each of our panelists. Okay, and I'll tell you what that is, and then I'll keep talking for a little bit so you can think about it. My question for each of the panelists is, tell me one thing that you're going to take away from this discussion tonight. One thing that you're going to remember, that you're going to apply, or that you're going to maybe follow up with a discussion with someone else on. So think about that for a minute. Next, I'm going to take care of some kind of facilitator business, right? Moderator business, I guess. We have an amazing set of comments and questions in the question and answer right now, like truly amazing. What I would propose to do, and I actually propose this to our coordinators at the UU Church, and thanks again to the UU Church for putting this on. This has been an amazing discussion, and I really am honored to be part of it. What I'd like to do is if Rose, who's kind of running our tech help, if you could save that list of question and answers, okay, and send them to me in their entirety. I hope that it captures everything. And then what I will do is I will put them together as kind of a follow-up blog post, and I will ask some of our panelists to weigh in on some of the answers, and we'll kind of do kind of a constructivist, radical imagination of how we would answer these questions. Throwing that to Posey, because like I said, some of these questions are absolutely amazing. The one thing that I want to shout out to, there are a number of things that are in here that I don't remember if this book is on my list, but I will make sure I add it before I post it to my blog. And that's a number of people recommend Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, specifically to dive deeper into Joe's question about the zero-sum game. And I second that endorsement as well. So I'm going to come back to our order here, and I'm going to start with Keyarah and kind of move my way through what I'm seeing on my screen. So Keyarah, tell me one thing that you're going to take away from this discussion tonight.
One thing I'm going to take away is to continue to educate myself and try and educate others, and definitely make sure that there's a safe space for everyone who is going through this, when everybody goes through this topic of racism. Also, I want to continue to take away the fact that you should always challenge the question as well.
Thank you very much. Next is Brandy.
Sorry about that. First, one thing I'm gonna take away is having a meeting with Posey and just letting her just teach me a lot of stuff. The next thing, what Nate just hit on at the end there about them not publicizing the good things, I want to start helping. I want to start maybe a blog about the great things the kids are doing in this district, in this city. And I never thought about till you said it that they don't publicize the great work. And I was just thinking of UNCC, and no one talks about how Mrs. Mitchell had all of these programs. They were never televised. You never knew the great things they did over there. So what I'm going to take away from Nate is a desire to talk about the good things instead of the bad things.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for mentioning Ms. Mitchell. We all are grieving right now for her loss. Thank you. Nate.
You know, when I get in these spaces where I'm with people who are passionate about the same things that I am, I'm reminded that this work has to be collective, right? This work cannot exist on an individual basis. This work cannot exist from an individual positionality standpoint. It can't just be Black people doing the work, can't just be men doing the work, can't just be straight people. It's intersectional, right? We're talking about race and gender. You have to have everybody at the table for the table to work for everybody, right? So it's just reminding me to continue to commune and to connect with people who look like me and people who don't, right? Because that's what the world's made of, and that's what the world will continue to exist as a representation of. So thank you for everybody, to everybody.
Thank you, Nate. Elizabeth.
So it was a comment that Posey made, and it was about not assuming that Black or African American people or any person of color has any certain degree of knowledge about racism, racial injustice. So keep that in mind. That is an assumption that I was thinking about. Yeah, I do make that assumption. So I'm going to challenge that assumption moving forward. And I really appreciate it having been brought to my attention. So thank you, Posey. And then also celebrating Black joy. It's important that, you know, we remain critical of injustices, of course, and we don't look past injustices that are happening and bad things that are being done to people of color, but also remember to celebrate Black joy too, and Black accomplishment and Black excellence.
Thank you. Posey.
The biggest thing I'm taking away is that we are here. There are people in this world that care sincerely about developing and supporting and co-creating with young people the world we desire, right? We want as many young people as possible to not have to recover from their childhood, right? And it brings me so much joy that it's people in the room, right? Not just the panelists, it's people in the room, diverse people in the room who really believe that our way forward is with and understanding and co-creating with young people. And so I'm excited about that. And thank y'all for sharing this space. This is really cool space.
Yeah, thank you. And as the moderator, I don't like taking the last word, but I'm going to for a second. I just want to thank these 5 amazing individuals for sharing their thoughts, their ideas, and their wisdom about this topic. It's not an easy topic, and as some of the people in the question and answer pointed out, I see Jan, I see Renee, I see Tina, I see Amy, I'm looking through a little lens. Who's that? Okay, I'm too old. Romper room, right? I'm looking through the magic glass. Okay. Denise, there are a number of people here who talk about the fact in these questions, and these are going to be ones that are going to be fun to answer, that this is not easy. This work is not easy, and this work is more entrenched, and we will face more pushback than we have ever experienced in our lives as we move forward, whether it's radically imagining new things or whether it's dismantling. We have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate the call for it being collective. I heard that from every single one of you today. I'm going to turn it back over to Priscilla. Again, thanking the UU Church of Urbana Champaign, and thanking everyone, the panelists especially, but everyone who participated in this amazing discussion. Thank you. Priscilla.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I spent 34 plus years in the public schools myself, and this is the time when the bell rings and I want to hold that door closed and say, no, you cannot leave my classroom because this is just too exciting. So this was a wonderful discussion. And of course, there's so much more that you folks could have talked about, that Dawn could have asked you, that the audience, viewing audience could have asked questions about. So hopefully you'll go to Dawn's blog at ddowennedd.blog and check out the resources. And hopefully when these questions get up there, we invite everybody to do that. And of course, to seek out your own information. There are so many books and resources available at the library and everywhere else. So of course, at this point in the evening, I have to express a huge thank you to Don Owen. Don, for sharing your facilitation skills and your experience with this topic. It's been a pleasure. I know it was a surprise when I reached out to you, but it's been a nice connection. And a very special thank you to our panelists. Brandy, here in little pictures up at the top now. Brandy, Elizabeth, Nate, Keyarah, Posey, Keyarah, I think it is, I'm sorry, Keyarah, and Posey. Thank you for your willingness to participate. I know this isn't always an easy thing to do, and for sharing your thoughts. Very much appreciated. Also, I would like to thank Jim Hannum and Rose St. Clair of UUCUC. This would not have been possible except for all of their efforts putting this together. And to all of you in the viewing audience, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was wonderful to see the numbers and the questions at the end. It's just fabulous. I'm so glad that everybody was so involved. You obviously found it valuable. I won't say that I hope you found it valuable. And I hope that you have been inspired to continue to explore this topic and other topics. So at this point, it's about 8:30. On behalf of UUCUC, may our community continue to hold these courageous conversations. So good night, everyone. Be well.